Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to session 4 today at the Information Literacy Summit. My name is Ken Arenik. I am a librarian at the College of DuPage, and I'll be serving as the co-moderator along with Jill King from DePaul University. The session's title today is A Defining Moment, COVID-19 and the First 100 Days of U.S. News Coverage. And our presenter is Dr. Alison Head, Executive Director of Project Information Literacy. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so we ask that you enter any questions you might have in chat, and there might be some interactive portions of today's session where we'll ask you to possibly to unmute your mic and ask questions at that point. So now I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Alison Head.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today to talk about COVID, a topic that I'm proud to see you here and willing to talk about to this day, since it's all we've been talking about for the last year. I think I might be able to offer something different here today, though, that I want to share with you. This presentation will be more of a how-to for you in case you want to use this resource, or in case you want to make your own resources for creating your own OER for students or faculty or whatever. So this is the raw materials, and I'll tell you how I did it. The first thing that we wanted to do, I want to introduce the team. As I said, I'm Alison Head. I'm the PI, or the Director of Project Information Literacy, and I'm a social scientist by training, an information science PhD from Berkeley, actually, many years ago, as I told Ken. And my interest all along has been project information literacy. Before that, I was a new media professor. And I have a background in journalism. I actually have a master in journalism, which helped shape this project and my interests. What we wanted to do, I'll introduce the rest of the team as I go along here. We wanted to create an OER that faculty could start using. And we're finding faculty are just beginning to use this, as well as librarians. Takes a long time for PIL research and resources to be picked up and to be used. So I'm hoping that you help us spread the word, because I think it's somewhat of a really cool, invaluable kind of resource for doing two things. For teaching news literacy, which more and more has become a subset of information literacy, and also visual literacy, which is something that librarians and a lot of faculty across the disciplines don't focus on much. How would you tackle that? How would you present some sort of learning resources, which this web-based resource offers? It's a two-part series. How would you offer some learning prompts, which are included, as well as some data? We wanted to, now I'll introduce the different folks on the project. We've got Stephen Braun, who's amazing. He's a scientist. He's worked in libraries, in academic libraries. He's a scientist by training. He teaches InfoViz and coding and millions of things, actually, data science at Northeastern University. He's an amazing individual. He created the graphics that we used in this project, and also was front and center for how to define the questions that we asked. We've got Elena Bull, who joined us a little bit later in the project, who's a first-year experienced librarian at University of Washington at Tacoma. She really helped us shape the learning prompts, as well as doing coding of images that we use in part 2 for the visual literacy. We've got Margie McMillan, all round, knows everything, senior researcher at PIL, as we all know, on the team. And she has an expertise in SODL, which was invaluable for generating and developing the learning resources with Elena. We've got Jessica Yurkovsky, who recently had gotten her MLS. She's a design person and also data science. She comes from the Meta Lab at Harvard. I knew her from my work there. Her expertise is really design and info design. If you follow PIL, and some folks do, thank you. In the algo report, Jessica produced that great info viz of the little person in the image of a day in the life of algos. So we could combine the interests of both Stephen and Jessica for the visual literacy, as well as the questions we would ask, as well as Elena and Margie for the learning resources that we produce, as well as their understanding of news. I should add, Margie McMillan was an academic librarian for 29 years at Mount Royal University. She was also the liaison to the Communication and Journalism Department. So what we wanted to do, we got together, you can see the duration, if you remember back to COVID and how we first learned of it. It started in March before we were all in quarantine, which seems like a million years ago. And we got together, Stephen was our new fellow at PIL, and we thought, what are we gonna focus on? And then there's this coronavirus thing that's happening. And there's a bunch of news and people can't get accurate information. This is something about misinformation, but Stephen and Jessica were both saying, but it's about the visuals. What if we got together and met every week and really probed these questions and thought, how could we produce highly interactive graphs, which Stephen had the expertise in coding R, and Jessica was aware of them as well and recommended a resource called mediacloud.org. And I'll go into more depth there in a minute. I, as a researcher and the PI at PIL, and Margie felt the same way as far as pedagogy, what if there was a resource where students could dig into the data themselves and they could make connections for their lived experiences because they were living it. And when they came back in the fall, or even this year, if this resource was used, they would remember when they first heard about COVID. So it had a lot of potential for where InfoLit pedagogy is going and where it could extend, especially in the area of visual literacy. So here are some things that kind of framed up our early discussions, which were extremely rich discussions. We had a private donor who said, just run with it, experiment with it. This is a crazy time. This is the dream funding. We really didn't have a proposal. We didn't know what we were making. Also, we were stepping out of our usual comfort zone at PIL, where as a national research institute, we do these huge, large-scale studies. But we did, at the bottom here, referencing the slide, we did have an interest in news, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I had an overall interest in news, as did the team in our discussions. The prominence of images in news, Pointer Media Institute had done some really interesting research that individuals only read a news story if there is an image. Yet Margie said, but sometimes the image doesn't match the story. And so how did this all play out at a time where news is moving quicker and quicker? At the same time, media trust is at an all-time low. In 2016, there's a Gallup study, it's done by Art Swift, where he finds that only 32% of the public trusts the media. And this is at a time where Trump is president and the whole fear of fake news is being whipped up. The same time, and I found this interesting, this was the impossible story for journalists, especially journalists at static news sites, which was the sample that we ended up using in this study. Newsrooms were shrinking. Regional papers were disappearing. Gannett was closing newspapers right and left. Pointer had a running list of what newspapers had closed that week that they'd add to. It's still up if you have an interest in that and want to weave it into your own instruction. Also, we had an interest in news. We had done a lot of research about news and how students engaged with news. Given the time last year, we didn't have access to students for one of the first times. We weren't going to do a large scale study, but since we always like a challenge at PIL, we thought, what if we did a study that the data was unrolling and happening as we were doing the research. That's a gamble. That's a really interesting kind of study, as well as an end product of this OER that's written for students, not for folks like you, not for faculty, which is our usual readership, but is written at a level that you could use it as a handout with major findings, just 5 to 7 pages, 2 reports. Here's what we learned from the news study. And this helped inform, we learned a lot. It's a huge study. We were collecting data in 2017. It comes out in 2018. And ACRL funded it, as well as Knight Foundation. It's kind of the dream team of funders. This sample that these figures are represented from in our infograph is from the college audience. And there were a couple of interesting things. Almost 6,000 students from 11 institutions across the US in this study. The first thing we learned is news is important. And students agreed with the statement that news was important for a democracy, which seems kind of obvious. 8 in 10 said it was. But more interestingly, 6 in 10 said it's my civic responsibility. If you look at the infographic, half of them are reading news about politics. It's probably one of the most contentious times in our country, as it ends up playing out, for politics with Trump in office. News is social, and I'm not talking about social media. I'm really talking about this interesting finding where peers and talking to news with friends or talking about news in class is something that helps define the news process. News is talked about, and often we think of news as something that's just given, and you read it over breakfast, and you don't talk about it. This was very different for this generation, and probably for the world at large at the time. News is overwhelming. We all know this. We thought this was a softball question. However, if you look at the infographic, I think the results are really interesting. Out of 6,000 college students, 68% said, I'm overwhelmed by the news every day. More interestingly, 5 in 10 said, I can't tell the most important story of the day when I look at a news site. So they're overwhelmed and unable to be discerning news readers about what is going on in the world around them and is most important to be discussing. News is work. We know this from the work of Sam Weinberg and also Mike Caulfield and some of our work. My favorite quote, it kind of sums it up from this study, is in a follow-up interview, a student said in life sciences, I spend more time looking for an unbiased site than I do reading the news. So that kind of sums it up as far as what the process includes. But my orange circle here informed this project. And that was that 70% of the sample had heard about news from faculty, from their professors in class. This finding helped inform the COVID study. We could take the findings that I just showed on this slide and use them to inform another study and take theory and apply it to practice, which I'm talking about today, which is the OER. We use news, not students, like we usually did. We use news as the subject of study. We also wanted, through the learning resources that Elena, and also I see Barbara Pfister here, Barbara Pfister contributed to as well, and was our reviewer, and Margie McMillan put together, to really create learning prompts that would scaffold news discussions in class. Because we found faculty and librarians would talk about news, but more in passing, like an icebreaker in class. And that if it was structured, we could begin to see news as something that we could leverage the social practice as well as the role of civic literacy, yet a new concept that started to come up during the time we were doing this study. The last thing is we really want to help students develop student awareness about the news, but I would come back to our lifelong learning study in 2016, and probably one of the best takeaways from PIL research, certainly in the top 10, And that is when we asked recent grads, about 1,600, what they had learned from college, only 27% had reported that they had learned to ask questions of their own. So this is the kind of resource that gives them practice in asking questions of their own, as well as reflecting on their learned experience. Here are the 3 research questions. The first question is, this is what we asked to develop the OER. So this is research, but it's also a maker report in that sense. So we're covering a lot of things to, again, come back to this objective of research, discovery, and critical literacy. We want to get these things across in the OER. Here are the 3 research questions. How did the story develop over time? Now, this is an interesting question because for the most part, what happens when news is covered in class, it's a single story. What if we looked at stories over 100 days while they were happening? What would that look like? We ended up calling this, thanks to Margie, the shape of news, both the ebbs and the flows and peaks of news. The second question we had was, how does media manage our attention? Where are we drawn? What's its message? And the third question here, how do visuals shape the national narrative? But also in that second question, how do interviews and authority figures define who gets talked about, who doesn't, who gets to talk, who doesn't, and what gets covered? We know, for instance, from ProPublica and some other work that came out around COVID, that BIPOC was tremendously underrepresented in those first 100 days. So this is a rich database for further inquiry. We certainly couldn't cover everything in 2 reports called the COVID series, which are up on the PIL site, and they're open access. Here's the data. And I'll just run through this quickly because you'll see the results. But we worked with a huge data set from MediaCloud.org. It's produced by the MIT Media Lab in collaboration with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. It's an incredible resource for understanding and doing your own research in a simple kind of Google search box about the media ecosystem. Again, static news sites, so that you're familiar with that. So we choose, Stephen likes to do big things. And we like to do big things. So this was a good match. So we had a sample of over 125,000 news articles. They were taken from 66 US news outlets, both traditional sources and digital only. When I say digital only, I'm thinking of HuffPost, Business Insider, and such, that really just don't have a traditional print delivered at your doorstep kind of news production. Okay, the second phase of this we did, and I'll show you the results of this, we looked at, well, what are the top 12 news producers? Who's really got the megaphone here? Who's really producing the most news? Well, it turns out it's 60% of the 66 news outlets are. Then secondly, in the second report, we talk about visual messaging. And from those 12, that subset, from those 12 news outlets, again, remember static. I'm not talking about Rachel Maddow here. I'm talking about a web presence. We chose 532 randomly selected images, and Margie and Elena coded those images from those 12 outlets. We were particularly interested in the emotional content. Okay, here's the first chart, and this is a thing of beauty produced by Stephen Braun. I can't tell you how many versions of this chart we went through. Media Cloud has a great access to open access news, and you can pull the different stories, and you can make a really interesting interactive graph out of what's available. Here's the caveat. News as a data set is extremely messy. And so we kept going back and having to change it and update it. In library terms, there is no authority control for the most part. That's where it breaks down. Titles change, headlines change, even authors, reporters on certain stories as stories develop, even dates. So this became a really problematic data set for us to work with. Stephen, as it turns out, ended up using this year, the data set in a course that he was teaching about working with a rigorous data set, working and doing rigorous analysis. Let's pop in here. Steve's been coaching me. Here's the actual report. It's got a beautiful layout. You see key findings, introduction, short sections, written at a student level. And then you get a 7-day total count and daily average. Here are the key events, and I'm going to go to March 12th, when the news tsunami begins. And why does the news tsunami begin? Well, we get more stories. It's the first big peak. I love this chart because it's so rich and it really develops something that students can work with. The NBA season gets canceled on the 12th. Oops. I'm losing here. Okay, the NBA season gets canceled on the 12th. God forbid Tom Hanks and his wife are diagnosed with COVID in Australia. It's becoming more and more pervasive and common. The stock market plummets. Trump puts the travel embargo. And in California, where I live, the shutdown began. So this is an important date. Now, if I was a student, I could explore that, but I could do more. And this is very cool. I clicked on this, and here is sample stories from some of the news outlets in our sample. So you can scan down and say, gee, the HuffPost talked about Major League Baseball. And meanwhile, the San Francisco Chronicle talked about Italy because they have a huge Italian population. So you could really explore this and discover things of your own. It is, where am I? I'm trying to go back here, help.
You can go to the yellow tab, or directly right there. Oh, you just had it. Go to the left a little bit, to your left.
That's my email.
Right there. Up. To the right. 2 over. 1 over to the left. Just move it a little bit.
See, I can't see that.
Click. There we go. Oh.
Okay. Let's try this again.
Okay.
Okay, stay with me here. Of course.
So if you go into your share button in Zoom, there we go. And you can move that share bar if you have something at the top.
There, I'm back.
Got it? Okay, great.
Okay, great. Also, as some people know on the project, certainly Barbara does, I'm colorblind. My world's not color-coded, but I figured out what you meant. Okay, we're back on track. Okay, and okay, thanks. Sorry about that, everybody. Here is the next chart that we end up producing, actually, and that appears in that first report, which is the first 100 days. What surprises you about this result, about these results? Save that until later, and we'll take a couple of questions for time, if nothing else. But what's interesting here is this is a heat map that shows, this isn't live, that shows what news outlets out of the top 12 produce the most news. So Business Insider comes up first, and then Fox News and CNN. And what I thought would come up first, the New York Times, doesn't really start covering. This is day by day. And here's the intensity of the news coverage, as well as the number of stories. Doesn't cover COVID as soon as Business Insider does. And I hate to say it, everybody, Fox News and New York Post are first as far as their coverage. And The takeaways from the first report are that from that last graph, something you rarely see, which is a list of the news outlets that you never see the names of the news outlets if you think about it. It's usually you see the first chart, how news moves, and you might just see it in a certain week or on a certain day. So this presents a really different view of news literacy. I think what's interesting about that chart that I just showed with the heat map is it shows that digital-only news outlets were covering much more news. You can also go and find, when you think about managing the attention, when do we start caring about COVID in the US? It's really around the death of Li Wen, the Wuhan doctor, the ophthalmologist who's the whistleblower in China. He's 36 years old, who keeps saying there's something horrible happening in China. It's spreading, people are dying. And this becomes a social justice story. And New York Times and other papers begin to talk about COVID, really for the first time. The last question, I gave you a taste of the news tsunami, and I'll skip down, but we can look at individual angles. Question that was interesting to us is, how did COVID coverage begin? Well, Business Insider, it begins as a business story. Here's the second report. What emotion, we asked ourselves, does this image evoke? If we were to code, which we did, 532 images, what are visual constructions of reality to a world we once knew that we can no longer get to? And what we found is from 5 emotions that we covered, 532 images, this random sample, we found that fear came up most often, 33%. And then we get this counterpoint of different emotions. We have fear, and then secondly, most often was hope. So we get this mix of these different images and really the visual shorthand for a world we can no longer visit because we're in shutdown, even though we commonly visited. We also see loneliness, determination, and grief. What is useful, again, this is interactive, what's useful in this chart is it shows that fear begins and loneliness and determination are the first images that we start to see from these 12 top producing news outlets. We also looked at the setting of image. Workplace was common, which is kind of ironic since workplaces were closing. Over on the right, this is just a screenshot and it's a copy and paste, is something else. We provided a table. This is just one image. It gives the photo credit. Because newspapers had lowered their paywalls, we were able also to provide direct access to full text, and we would have never been able to do that. If you decide to do this or play in this arena, be careful, because the licensed images were where we use the private funders' money. We were buying licensed images for $300 and $400 a piece for reuse. What's probably most useful in terms of the learning resources and to folks like you is we show our coding language. Here's an interesting image. This is in the fear category, and we see it's a candid shot. No one's looking directly at the screen, looking directly at the camera. The subject's looking downward, and also it's done in grays and the backs are to you. So students themselves could choose images to code themselves. The takeaway, 5 minutes to go.
5 minutes, yes.
Okay, I'm on it. And I am proud to say I'm moving towards the end. So the takeaways from this second report, the visual messaging report, really do speak to the critical literacy lessons we were hoping to provide through the OER. And the first is the embedded discrimination, as well as race. As I said earlier, BIPOC is not represented in positions of power. And in fact, what we discovered using TinEye, and we have a learning prompt around using TinEye for students to discover that resource themselves, we found that stock were really common, as well as the blob, which was rendered to look scarier by the CDC than a gray blob would have been of COVID that was often used in when news outlets didn't have a photo. I think these last two categories combine geographic bias as well as death. Interesting on both counts, and also using TinEye by tracking back the images of hospitals. They were in China and Europe. They weren't in the US. There are concerns around HIPAA, but there are other concerns about, and this is really the last category, the double standards in this country with American journalism for not presenting death in newspapers. Death occurs someplace else. 9/11 probably broke that rule, but for the most part, you'll probably never look at a news paper again or a news site again without thinking that you don't see death. Here are some sources. These slides will be available, Ken tells me. And here are the learning resources. It's just an overview. Here are Jessica's great info vizzes for using with the learning resources for visual messaging and the prompts that we provided. The LMS slides, thanks to Barbara Pfister, were developed by her, who reviewed the site with the two series and said, hey, what about LMS slides? So we took her up on it. This is a really rich resource. It's contained in this web packet. And as I said, it's OA. So I have time to take a couple of questions. And I'm happy to answer anything because I certainly can't. I don't think I covered everything, but hopefully I whetted your interest about using this as well as talking to faculty. I will end by saying when I presented on this at one institution a couple of months ago, there was a biology professor who said, I want to use this as a way to study with my students a public health story and how that broke. As I said before, Stephen used it as an example in his class of data science of what do you do with a messy data set that's changing all the time? And as someone told me this morning, just in the nick of time, a librarian said, I recommended it to a new professor in journalism at our liberal arts school that had never taught before. And I said, you really want to knock it out of the water, talk about COVID, talk about news coverage, and use this. It's turnkey. Questions?
Thank you so much, Alison. It was really fascinating to hear about this process. It's an incredible resource. We've got some time for questions. Let me start off. Feel free to add questions to the chat. I'll start off with a couple that are there. There's a question, why do we think digital only had significantly more coverage earlier on?
You know, that's a great question. We asked it ourselves. And I think news organizations like Business Insider had reporters on the ground. In the Far East, they were able to get in and cover the story. New York Times certainly has reporters in those venues, but I think that we found that business, as it breaks as a business story, there was so much going on with technology in that part of the world as a supplier of chips, as we know now, that they were able to take those reporters and move them to COVID coverage. And they covered it as a business story and then eventually as a business travel story. And I think that's why you see the digital only publications. Also, they're not putting out a newspaper every day. They can constantly update their content because they have a website. So they do have an advantage over something like the New York Times. It's probably not as heavily edited as well as the New York Times is.
There's another question too. Early on in the presentation, you mentioned sometimes that the image did not match the news. Could you expand on that a bit and talk about your findings on the images propelling the news spread?
Yeah, the image question is fascinating, and because it's just not talked about, and there really isn't a lot of existing research. To answer your first question, we were able with TinEye and Margie went through, and it's what a fantastic librarian can do on a project like this that is a librarian researcher, and went through all 532 images and searched to see if they were stock shots. And I thought, oh, I don't know, maybe it's a waste of time for us to do that. But in reality, we found a lot of images actually were stock shots, which I think were interesting to begin with, especially around determination. Most of those images were from a different time. We also found there was candid use, even in publications like the New York Times, where it was just a personal shot that somebody had taken on a vacation. There was a hope photo of some snow borders or snowmobile folks. So the images themselves and this need for newspapers because it's how they get eyeballs. It's what gets amplified on social media are the images. Now to your second question, we were also able to look at the news. Again, it's not a huge sample, 532 images. It's Word, but if you're working on this every day, you can look at the content, which Margie and Elena did, to see if those images match the story. And in a few cases, I wouldn't say in 90% of the cases, but often they were out of context with the actual story, especially around death. And we know that's a shortage of images in the US. I've worked in newspapers, and a lot of folks don't realize that headlines are often written by somebody else, not the reporter. And news selection, which we talk about in the visual messaging report, is news images are chosen by a whole different department, by a photo department. And they go through and make their selections. And we talk about that process and what that means. There's a great quote where a photojournalist in a Scandinavian country, but it's certainly applicable here, said, I can't describe how I choose an image. It just, it's representative of the story. It will get eyeballs, and it hits me in the pit of my stomach. And so there is this emotional response to news images and how they're selected. And an editor may glance at it, but they're not in the selection process, and reporters aren't. It's often a criticism of a news story when it comes out, of God, that the journalist will say that image doesn't even match my story. Who chose that? But then it's too late.
That's so interesting.
It's fascinating. This was, one of Margie and I remember we worked late into the night at one point of, we need to tell the photojournalist story here, because often this was the impossible story. I mean, there's this tremendous pressure on them to have fresh images every day with the content, and as well as to come up with content and new news that was accurate. But photojournalists, for instance, talked about really being in the center of events, and that's how they cover events. They offer high fidelity, I was there. And really what you see are these, Stephen and I talked a lot about this as well, this flat representation of something somewhere that had happened, usually taken with a telephoto lens, because they couldn't get near enough to the story to cover it. And they were also worried, remember, it was before the vaccine, of getting sick. So this was a time, it's not that long ago, it's last year, when the disease is spreading and we really don't know what it is, except that we're stuck inside and we're relying on these news outlets to tell us about the stadium, the high school, the main street that we walk on every day. Show us that world, give us a window on that world. It's profoundly interesting from a visual point of view. And I like that report a lot.
Alison, unfortunately, we have run out of time. And
okay.
But I just want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, the work of your team. This has been a terrific presentation.
Thanks.
And
it was
I'm
fun.
sure we all virtually thank you. I see a lot of applause coming in. in the
on.
chat. And again, we will be releasing the video of the presentation shortly. So you all should receive an email about that. And I'm also going to add the breakout session schedule for those of you who plan to attend breakout session 5, which will take place at 12:30. So Dr. Head, thank you again so much. We really appreciate you being here with us.
My pleasure. And if somebody has a question that still remains that they really want to ask me about this, please contact me by email and I'll respond. I'm happy to. We're really proud of this resource and proud of what we made. We see this as something really different, and I can't thank the team, the amazing team at PIL, enough for their contribution. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Jill. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.